Vincent Caruso controlled everything from Boston to Atlantic City, and his empire was built on 3 generations of power and money and respect. But none of that mattered now because his only son, Marco, was dying in the master bedroom upstairs, and Vincent could do nothing to stop it from happening, and that helplessness was destroying him more than any rival ever could. Marco had collapsed 3 months ago during a normal business meeting, and he grabbed his head like something was tearing him apart from the inside. And since then, he got worse every single day, and the seizures came more often, and his vision faded to almost nothing, and some days he could not remember his own name or where he was or who his father was. And Vincent watched his boy disappear piece by piece. Vincent brought in the best doctors from every famous hospital in America, and he flew in specialists from Switzerland and Japan and Germany, and each one ran their tests and looked at the brain scans and said the same thing over and over again, until Vincent wanted to scream. And Marco had this rare condition where his own immune system was attacking his brain, and the inflammation was spreading too fast, and the normal treatments were not working, and there was nothing more they could do for him. 103 doctors had examined Marco, and 103 doctors had failed to save him. And Vincent stood in his study staring at the wall covered with medical reports and brain scans, and he felt like he was going insane because somewhere in this world there had to be someone who could fix this. Lou Battaglia sat quietly in the corner because he had worked for Vincent for 20 years, and he knew when to speak and when to stay silent, and right now, silence was the only safe choice because Vincent was barely holding himself together, and one wrong word could set him off. Vincent slammed his fist on the desk and papers went flying everywhere, and he said, "There has to be someone out there who can help my son." And Lou shifted in his chair and said, "Boss, we have tried everything and we contacted every major hospital and every research facility, and if there was someone we would have found them by now." Vincent turned on him with fury in his eyes and said, "Then we have not looked hard enough because he is my son Lou, and he is my only boy, and I did not build this empire to watch him die in that room upstairs." And the anger drained out of Vincent as fast as it came, and what replaced it was something nobody in the organization had ever seen before, which was pure, desperate fear. In the silence that followed, neither man heard the soft sound of a vacuum cleaner being turned off in the hallway just outside the study door, and they did not know that someone had been listening to every word they said. Grace Williams had worked as part of the cleaning crew at the Caruso estate for 6 years now, and she came every Tuesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock after the regular staff went home, and she cleaned until midnight, and she was invisible by design because that was safer for everyone, especially for a middle-aged black woman with a daughter to support. Grace had learned a long time ago that people like the Carusos did not really see people like her, and a woman pushing a cleaning cart might as well be a piece of furniture, and that was fine with Grace because she had bills to pay, and this job paid better than anything else she could get, and she needed every dollar for her daughter. But Grace noticed everything, even if people thought she noticed nothing. And over the past 3 months, she watched this house transform from a cold, efficient place into something consumed by grief and fear. And she saw the parade of fancy doctors, and she overheard countless conversations, and she cleaned up the blood after Marco had his seizures, and she washed sheets soaked with his fever sweat. One night, very late, she found Vincent Caruso crying in the hallway outside his son's room, and he did not see her standing there in the shadows with her cleaning cart, and she saw this powerful, dangerous man reduced to a broken father, and something in her heart twisted because she understood that kind of love. Tonight, Grace had been cleaning the hallway next to Vincent's study, and she heard every word he said to Lou, and she saw the medical reports during her rounds through the house, and she saw the brain scans showing the inflammation, and she recognized some of the medications they were trying because her daughter had talked about those same medications. Her daughter, Keisha, who was 28 years old and brilliant beyond measure, and currently working at a small hospital in Philadelphia, doing medical research that nobody paid attention to, even though it could change lives. And Keisha was buried in student debt and overlooked by everyone who mattered in the medical world. Grace pushed her cart down the hallway toward the kitchen, and her mind was racing because Keisha had spent the last 5 years studying autoimmune disorders, and she published papers that the medical establishment mostly ignored, and she developed experimental treatments that could not get funding because the system did not work for people like Keisha. Grace had listened to her daughter explain her research during their weekly phone calls, and Grace understood maybe 1 word in 10, but she recognized genius when she saw it, and she knew her daughter was special, and she knew Keisha had been studying cases exactly like Marco Caruso's case. The question now was whether Grace should risk everything to give her daughter this chance, because getting involved with the Carusos beyond cleaning their house was dangerous, and Grace knew that. But she also knew her daughter had gifts that the world needed to see. She reached the kitchen and started wiping down the counters, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. And she thought about Marco dying upstairs, and she thought about Keisha crying over patients she could not help because nobody would take a chance on her unconventional ideas, and she thought about justice and opportunity and risk. Grace heard footsteps, and Vincent Caruso walked into the kitchen, looking 10 years older than he had looked 3 months ago, and he did not acknowledge her at all, and he just walked to the window and stared out at the dark grounds beyond. Grace watched this broken man for a long moment, and she thought about all the potential trapped inside her brilliant daughter, and she thought about all the patients who would never be helped, because people like Keisha never got real chances, and she made her decision. She took a breath and said, "Mr. Caruso," and her voice was steady, even though her heart was hammering in her chest, and Vincent turned around, looking startled as if noticing her for the first time after 6 years of her cleaning his house. Vincent stared at Grace like she had just done something impossible, and Lou Battaglia appeared in the doorway with his hand moving toward the weapon under his jacket, because nobody interrupted Vincent Caruso, especially not the cleaning lady, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. Grace stood straighter, and she knew she had committed now and there was no going back, and she said, "I am sorry for speaking out of turn, sir, but I think I know someone who might be able to help your son," and her voice did not shake even though everything inside her was screaming that this was dangerous. Vincent looked at her for a long moment and said, "What did you just say?" and his voice was low and dangerous, and Lou moved closer, ready to remove Grace from the house if Vincent gave the word. Grace set down her cleaning cloth and said, "My daughter, Keisha Williams, is a doctor, and she does research on autoimmune disorders and brain inflammation, and she works at University Hospital in Philadelphia, and she has been studying cases exactly like your son's case for 5 years now." Lou stepped into the room and said, "Boss, we should not waste time on this," and Vincent held up his hand to silence Lou, and his eyes never left Grace's face, and he said, "A researcher at a university hospital, and we have had the heads of neurology from every major institution in the country look at Marco, so what makes you think your daughter could do anything they could not do?" Grace knew this was her only chance, and she said because she has spent 5 years studying cases that traditional medicine gave up on, and she developed new treatment methods that combine targeted immunotherapy with brain protection strategies, and the medical establishment will not fund her research because it is too experimental and too risky, and because she does not have the right connections. She paused and then said, "And because she is hungry, Mr. Caruso, and she has not spent decades learning what cannot be done, and she still believes in what might be possible, and she has not given up on patients like your son because she knows they deserve a chance." Vincent's jaw got tight and he said, "Do you understand what you are doing right now, and if this is some kind of trick or if you are wasting my time when my son is dying upstairs, then there will be consequences," and Grace could hear the threat in his voice. Grace interrupted him and said, "I am risking my job and possibly my life by speaking to you right now, and I do not want money and I do not want anything except for my daughter to have a chance to do what she was born to do, and if she can help your son, then that is enough for me." Lou moved closer and said, "Boss, this is crazy, and she is just a cleaning lady, and her daughter is probably some intern at a second-rate hospital, and we cannot trust this, and Vincent should just send her home right now." Grace turned to Lou and said, "Third-rate actually, and University Hospital is underfunded and understaffed, and Keisha graduated top of her class from medical school, but she could not get residency positions at the prestigious hospitals because she did not have the right connections or the right background. And she has spent 5 years proving herself in a system designed to keep people like her in the shadows." She looked back at Vincent and said, "Just like you have spent 3 months learning that prestige and connections cannot save your son, and sometimes the answer comes from the last place you think to look." The room went completely silent, and Vincent studied Grace with an intensity that would have made most people look away. But Grace held his gaze because she was fighting for her daughter's future now, and she would not back down. Vincent said, "Tell me about your daughter's work." and Grace explained as best she could about treatment methods that combined aggressive immunosuppression with compounds that protect the brain, and about targeting specific inflammatory pathways, instead of just shutting down the whole immune system. And she stumbled over the medical words, but her belief in Keisha was crystal clear. When Grace finished talking, Vincent was quiet for a long time, and then he turned to Lou and said, "Call the hospital in Philadelphia and find out everything about Dr. Keisha Williams, and I want her credentials, and her publications, and her research, and everything about her past, and do it right now." Lou nodded and left the room, already pulling out his phone, and Vincent looked back at Grace and said, "You can go back to your cleaning, and if your daughter is legitimate, then someone will contact her tomorrow. And if this turns out to be nothing," then he did not finish the threat, but it hung in the air between them like smoke. Grace said she is legitimate, Mr. Caruso, and she has just never had anyone give her a real chance before, and all she needs is one opportunity to prove what she can do. And Vincent nodded slowly, and Grace picked up her cleaning supplies with hands that were shaking just slightly. She left the kitchen and went back to her work, but her mind was racing because she had just thrown her daughter into the world of one of the most dangerous men on the East Coast, and she could only pray that it would lead to something good instead of something terrible. Grace finished her cleaning that night and drove home to her small apartment, and she sat in her car for 10 minutes trying to decide if she should call Keisha right now or wait until morning, and finally she decided to wait because there was nothing Keisha could do tonight anyway. But Grace did not sleep that night, and she lay in bed thinking about all the ways this could go wrong, and all the ways it could go right. And she thought about Marco Caruso dying in that bedroom, and she thought about her daughter's brilliant mind going to waste in a hospital that did not appreciate her. She thought about justice and opportunity, and the fact that sometimes you had to take huge risks to change your life, and sometimes you had to speak up, even when it was dangerous, and sometimes the only way to get what you deserved was to reach out and take it. Grace finally fell asleep around 5 in the morning, and when she woke up 2 hours later, she knew that everything had changed, and there was no going back now. And whatever happened next would determine the course of her daughter's entire life, and possibly her own life too, and all she could do was hope she had made the right choice. Keisha Williams was still in the lab at 11:30 that night reviewing data from her latest experiment when her phone rang, and she almost did not answer because it was an unknown number calling at a strange hour, but something made her pick up. A man's voice said Dr. Williams, and it was professional but had an edge that told Keisha this was not a normal call. And she said, "Yes, this is Dr. Williams, and who is calling?" And the man said, "My name is Lou Battaglia, and I am calling on behalf of Vincent Caruso, and I believe your mother works for Mr. Caruso." Keisha's blood went cold immediately, because in 6 years her mother had maybe mentioned her employer's name twice, and always in hushed, worried tones. And Keisha knew enough about Vincent Caruso to know he was not someone whose attention you wanted. And she said, "Is my mother okay?" Lou said she is fine, and in fact she is the reason I am calling, because Mr. Caruso's son is very ill, and your mother suggested you might be able to help. And I have spent the last 3 hours reviewing your credentials and your publications, and Mr. Caruso would like you to examine his son tomorrow, and all expenses will be paid, and you will be compensated for your time regardless of the outcome. Keisha sat down slowly, and her mind immediately went into doctor mode, and she said, "What is the condition?" And Lou said, "Autoimmune encephalitis with rapid progression, and he has seen over 100 specialists and nothing has worked so far." Keisha started thinking clinically and said, "What treatments have been attempted, and what are the current inflammatory markers, and what do the MRI findings show?" And Lou said, "I am sending you encrypted files right now with all the medical records, and there is a car coming to pick you up at 6 in the morning, and it is a 90-minute drive, and you will have time to review everything on the way." Keisha said, "Wait, I cannot just leave the hospital because I have patients and I have responsibilities here." And Lou's voice took on a harder edge, and he said, "Dr. Williams, let me be very clear about something. And this is not really a request. And your mother spoke up for you, which means Mr. Caruso's expectations are now on you, and you can help his son, or you can explain why you cannot, but you will be here tomorrow." The line went dead, and Keisha sat in the empty lab with her heart pounding, and she immediately called her mother. And when Grace answered, Keisha said, "Mom, what did you do?" Grace's voice was steady but apologetic, and she said, "I gave you a chance, baby, and it is the kind of chance you have been waiting for, and I know it is scary, and I know it is dangerous, but you need this opportunity, And Keisha said, "It is the mob, Mom. And do you understand what happens if I fail? And what happens to both of us?" Grace said, "I understand completely, but I also understand what happens if you never get to use that brilliant mind of yours. And how many more years are you going to waste in that hospital watching people die because no one will fund your research? And because no one will take a chance on your methods, and this boy is dying, Keisha. And you might be the only person who can save him." Keisha closed her eyes, and she knew her mother was right, even though it terrified her. And she had spent 5 years developing treatments for exactly this kind of case, and she had dreamed of getting the chance to prove her theories, and she just never imagined it would come like this. Keisha said, "If I do this, and if by some miracle it works, then these people will own us." And Grace said, "Maybe they will, or maybe we will finally have the resources and respect to do what we were always meant to do, and either way, baby, that boy needs help. And you did not become a doctor to turn away from people who need you." After they hung up, Keisha opened her laptop and found the encrypted files already waiting in her email, and she spent the rest of the night reviewing Marco Caruso's medical history, and with each page, her clinical detachment gave way to professional excitement because this was exactly the kind of case she had been studying. She could see where the other doctors had gone wrong, and she saw the opportunities they had missed, and she saw the narrow window that might still exist to save this young man's life. And by the time the black SUV arrived at 6 in the morning, Keisha had a treatment plan forming in her mind. She also had a very clear understanding of what failure would mean for her and for her mother, and possibly for her entire future. But she got in the SUV anyway because this was what she had trained for, and this was what she was meant to do. As Philadelphia disappeared in the rearview mirror, Keisha opened her laptop to refine her treatment protocol, and she thought about all the years of struggle, and all the rejection, and all the times people had dismissed her ideas. And now she finally had a chance to prove what she could do. Her mother sent a text that said, "I believe in you, and I always have, and I always will, and show them what you can do." And Keisha felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away because she needed to focus now. The drive to Connecticut took exactly 90 minutes, and Keisha used every minute to review the case and adjust her approach and prepare herself for what was coming. And when they finally pulled up to the Caruso estate, she saw the high walls and security cameras and hard-faced men watching her with suspicion. She wore her only professional suit and carried a medical bag borrowed from the hospital, and she tried to project confidence she did not entirely feel because she was 28 years old, and she was about to walk into a situation that could either make her career or end her life. Vincent Caruso met her in the entrance, and he was shorter than she expected, but he had the kind of power that had nothing to do with physical size, and his eyes assessed her in about 3 seconds, and she could feel the weight of his judgment. He said, "Dr. Williams, and you are young," and Keisha lifted her chin and said, "I am 28, and Mozart was dead by 35. So age is not always the same as ability," and a ghost of a smile crossed Vincent's face. He said, "Your mother has more nerve than I gave her credit for, and then come with me because my son's room is upstairs," and Keisha followed him through the mansion toward whatever waited for her there. Vincent led Keisha through the mansion to a bedroom that had been converted into a full medical suite with monitors beeping steadily, and IV stands lined up against one wall, and in the bed, barely recognizable as the young man from the photos she had seen, lay Marco Caruso. He was pale and thin, and his breathing was shallow, and even unconscious, his body occasionally twitched with small seizures, and Keisha approached slowly, letting her medical training take over, and pushing down the fear that wanted to overwhelm her. She spent the next 2 hours conducting the most thorough examination she had ever done, and Vincent watched from a chair in the corner, silent as death, and Keisha reviewed every test and every scan and every treatment that had been attempted, and she took new blood samples and checked reflexes and examined how his pupils responded to light. She studied the latest MRI images on her laptop and compared them to images from weeks earlier, and she could see the progression of the inflammation, and she could see why the standard treatments had failed, and finally she stepped back and turned to face Vincent. She said, "Your son is dying, but you already know that. And what you need to know is why the treatments have not worked, and the doctors who examined him were not wrong about the diagnosis, but they were completely wrong about the approach." Vincent leaned forward in his chair and said, "Explain it to me." And Keisha took a breath and said, "Autoimmune encephalitis is typically treated with aggressive immunosuppression, which means trying to shut down the immune system's attack on the brain, and that is what they have been doing. But your son's case is different. She pulled up images on her tablet and said his immune system is not attacking his brain randomly, and it is targeting specific neural pathways while leaving others relatively intact. And the standard treatments are like using a sledgehammer when you need a scalpel, and that is why nothing has worked. Vincent said, and you have a scalpel? And Keisha pulled out a document on her tablet and said, I have been working on a targeted immunotherapy protocol. And instead of shutting down the entire immune system, we identify the specific antibodies attacking the brain and we neutralize them while leaving the rest of the immune function intact. She continued and said we combine that with compounds that protect the brain cells and help them heal from the damage already done. And there is a chance, and she emphasized the word chance, that we could reverse this. But Vincent interrupted and said the specialist from Johns Hopkins said experimental treatments were too risky at this stage. Keisha looked him directly in the eyes and said, the specialists from Johns Hopkins are protecting their reputations and they will not try something unconventional, because if it fails it looks bad for them, and I do not have a reputation to protect. Mr. Caruso, and what I have is a patient who will definitely die if we do nothing, and might survive if we try something different. Vincent said might, and Keisha said medicine does not offer guarantees, but I have studied 17 cases similar to your son's case, and the traditional approach failed in all of them, and my protocol tested in limited trials on 5 patients with similar conditions showed significant improvement in 4 and 1 made a complete recovery. Vincent stood up and walked to his son's bedside and placed a hand on Marco's shoulder, and when he spoke his voice was rough and he said, and the 5th patient, and Keisha said died, but they were going to die anyway, just like your son will, if we do not act fast. She pulled up the most recent scans and said the inflammation in his brain is accelerating. And based on these images, I would give him 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the damage is irreversible, even if we could stop the immune attack, and we are running out of time. Vincent was quiet for a long moment, looking down at his unconscious son, and then he said, what do you need? And Keisha said, equipment and medications and access to a compounding pharmacy, and I am sending you a list right now. And some of these compounds are experimental, and you will not find them through normal channels, but I'm guessing that is not a problem for you. Vincent said it is not a problem, and what else do you need? And Keisha said time and space to work, and I need to stay here and monitor him around the clock and adjust dosages based on his response, and this is not something I can do in a few hours and then leave. Vincent turned to face her fully and said, you understand what you are committing to, and if you stay here and if you try this treatment and my son dies anyway, there will be consequences. And his voice was cold, and Keisha felt ice run down her spine. But she met his gaze and said, if I do not try and he dies, knowing I might have saved him, then I will face my own consequences every day for the rest of my life. And I did not become a doctor to play it safe, Mr. Caruso. And I became a doctor to help people everyone else has given up on. Something shifted in Vincent's expression, and for the first time since she arrived, his hard exterior cracked slightly, and he said, he is a good kid, and he is better than me, and he was trying to get out and go legitimate, and this family and this life is not what he wanted, Keisha said softly. Then let us give him the chance to have the life he wants, and Vincent nodded slowly and said, you will have everything on your list within 6 hours, and there is a bedroom next to this one, and it is yours now, and my staff will bring you anything you need. As if she had been summoned, Grace appeared in the doorway with fresh linens, and her eyes met her daughter's, and a silent question passed between them, and Keisha nodded slightly to tell her mother that she was committed now. Grace came into the room and started making up the bed in the adjacent room, and Keisha turned back to Marco and began setting up her equipment and preparing her treatment plan, and Vincent watched for another moment before leaving the room. Lou appeared in the hallway and said to Vincent that he hoped the boss knew what he was doing, trusting some unknown researcher. And Vincent said, we are out of options, Lou, and sometimes you have to take a chance on the person nobody else believes in. Keisha heard this through the open door, and she felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders like a physical thing, and she looked at Marco lying there dying, and she thought about all the years she had spent preparing for a moment like this, and now that it was here, she could not fail. The first 72 hours were the most critical period of Keisha's entire career, and she barely slept more than 15 minutes at a time, and she caught those brief naps in the chair beside Marco's bed, while monitoring his vital signs constantly. The equipment that Vincent's people had acquired was better than anything at her hospital, and the medications, including the experimental compounds she had specified, arrived within 4 hours, and Keisha started with a carefully calculated dose of the targeted immunotherapy combining 3 different antibodies she had been developing in her research. Then came the compounds designed to protect his brain cells and help them resist the ongoing inflammation and potentially repair some of the damage that had already been done, and for the first 24 hours there was absolutely no change, and Marco remained unconscious with his vitals steady but weak. Keisha adjusted doses every few hours and ran blood tests every 6 hours and kept detailed notes on every tiny shift in his condition, and Vincent checked in hourly saying nothing and just standing in the doorway watching, and Grace brought meals that Keisha barely touched and coffee that she drank like it was keeping her alive. The mansion's regular staff gave Keisha a wide distance except for Lou, who seemed to have appointed himself as her connection to the outside world, and he brought her whatever she needed without question, and sometimes he just sat in the corner of the room watching like he was guarding something precious. On the second day, Marco's fever spiked dramatically, and Keisha had expected this because it was a sign that his immune system was responding to the treatment, and it could be either a very good sign or a catastrophic one, and there was no way to know yet which it would be. She gave him more medications and adjusted the IV fluids and watched the monitors with an intensity that made her eyes burn and her head ache, and Vincent appeared in the doorway and asked in a tight voice if Marco was getting worse. Keisha did not look away from the screens and said, "He is responding, and whether that response will be positive or negative, I will not know for another 12 hours, and his body is at war with itself, Mr. Caruso, and we are trying to broker a peace agreement. But the battle has to play out first." Vincent stepped into the room and said, "I have built my life on reading people, Dr. Williams, and on knowing when someone is lying to make me feel better. So do not do that and tell me the truth. And is my son going to die?" Keisha finally turned to look at him and said, "Honestly, I do not know. And the science says this should work, and the theory is sound, but theory and practice are different things, and every patient responds differently. And what I can tell you is that I am doing everything I know how to do." She continued and said, "I am watching him closer than I have ever watched any patient, and if there is a chance to save him, I am going to find it, and that is all I can promise you." And Vincent studied her for a long moment, and then nodded and said, "That is all I can ask for." He left and Keisha returned to her constant monitoring, and at 3 in the morning on the 3rd day something changed, and Marco's fever broke suddenly, and his temperature dropped 4 degrees in 30 minutes, and Keisha's heart started racing as she checked and rechecked all the monitors. His brainwave patterns were shifting and becoming more organized, and the inflammatory markers in his blood were dropping significantly, and Keisha was afraid to hope, but she could not help the feeling rising in her chest. By dawn, Marco's breathing had strengthened and his color was better, and when Keisha checked his pupils, they reacted more quickly to light than they had since she first arrived, and she was running another blood test when she heard it, and it was a soft groan from the bed. Keisha moved to Marco's side immediately, and his eyelids were fluttering, and after 3 days of deep unconsciousness he was waking up, and she said, "Marco, can you hear me? And I am Dr. Williams, and you are safe, and do not try to move too quickly." His eyes opened slowly, and they were unfocused at first, but then gradually they found her face, and he whispered, "Where am I?" and his voice was barely audible. And Keisha said, "You are at home, and you have been very sick, but you are getting better now." Marco said, "It hurts," and Keisha said, "I know it does, but that will improve, and you just need to rest right now." And Marco's eyes closed again, but this time it was natural sleep rather than the unconsciousness he had been trapped in. Keisha checked his vitals one more time, and then she allowed herself a small smile, and she walked to the door and found Vincent already standing there, as if he had sensed the change in his son, and she said simply, "He woke up." Vincent's entire face transformed, and without a word he moved past Keisha to his son's bedside, and he took Marco's hand in his own, and his shoulders shook with silent tears, and Keisha quietly left the room to give him privacy with his son. In Tsankyorim, the hallway, Grace was waiting, and she whispered, "I heard he woke up," and Keisha nodded and said, "It is too early to celebrate because we are not out of danger yet, but it is a good sign, and it is a really good sign." Grace pulled her daughter into a fierce hug and said, I knew you could do it, and I always knew you had this in you, and Keisha said we are not finished yet. Mom, and there is still a long road ahead, but Grace just held her tighter. Keisha let herself relax into her mother's embrace for just a moment, and she felt the exhaustion of 3 days with almost no sleep, trying to drag her down. But she could not rest yet, because Marco would need constant monitoring for at least another week. But for the first time since she had arrived at the Caruso estate, Keisha felt like maybe they had a real chance, and maybe her theories were not just theories anymore, and maybe she had actually saved a life that everyone else had given up on. Vincent came out of Marco's room, and his eyes were red, but his voice was steady when he said, "Thank you, Dr. Williams." And those 2 words carried more weight than any praise Keisha had ever received. And she nodded and said, "We still have work to do, but we won the first battle." Vincent said, "Whatever you need, and I mean anything at all, and you will have it." And Keisha said, "Right now I need to monitor him closely for the next several days, and after that we can talk about what comes next." And Vincent nodded and left her to her work. Keisha went back into Marco's room and sat in her chair and looked at the young man sleeping peacefully now. And she thought about all the impossible things that had led to this moment, and she knew her life would never be the same. 2 weeks later, Marco was sitting up in bed eating solid food and complaining about being bored. And Keisha considered all of these things to be minor miracles, because 2 weeks ago he had been dying, and now he was alive, and getting stronger every day. His recovery was not complete yet, and he still had occasional headaches and some memory gaps from the worst days of his illness, and he got tired easily, but the brain scans showed the inflammation had reduced by 70%, and his immune system had stopped attacking itself. Keisha had adapted to her strange new life in the Caruso mansion, and she moved from the bedroom next to Marco's to a small suite on the 2nd floor, and her mornings were spent monitoring Marco's progress and adjusting his medications and running cognitive tests to make sure his brain was healing properly. Her afternoon she spent in what used to be a library, and was now her makeshift laboratory where she analyzed data and refined her treatment protocols, and Vincent had given her equipment she had only dreamed about at the university hospital. When she mentioned needing certain research materials, they appeared within days, and Vincent had even arranged for 2 lab assistants to be brought in, and they were members of his organization with legitimate medical training, who asked no questions and followed her instructions exactly. Vincent found her one afternoon surrounded by research papers and chemical formulas, and he said, "You are building something here, and this is not just about Marco anymore." And Keisha looked up from her work. She said, "Your son's case proved my theories." Work. But he is not the only person suffering from conditions like this, and there are hundreds of patients out there that conventional medicine has given up on. And if I can refine these protocols and standardize them and make them reproducible, then I could save a lot of lives. Vincent sat down across from her and said, "What would you need to do this properly?" And Keisha said, "A real lab and clinical trial approvals and funding for research assistants and supplies, and for the years of work it would take to get proper medical approval." And she laughed bitterly. She said, "Everything I could not get before because I did not have the right credentials or the right connections or the right skin color." And Vincent was quiet for a moment, and then said, "The money is no problem. And I can set up a research foundation and fund it heavily, and make you the director." He continued and said, "The credentials, though, you need institutional backing and a hospital or university affiliation." And Keisha said no legitimate institution would work with someone funded by. And she stopped, not sure how to phrase it politely. Vincent smiled without humor and said, "By a criminal." And you're probably right, but money can buy a lot of things, including respectability. So let me make some calls and see what I can arrange. 3 days later, Vincent presented Keisha with a proposal, and a struggling private hospital in Connecticut was on the verge of bankruptcy, and they were willing to create a new autoimmune research center with Keisha as its director. The funding would come through a series of legitimate shell companies and charitable foundations that obscured the true source, and she would have complete freedom and resources, and most importantly, the institutional backing to conduct proper clinical trials. Vincent said, "There is a price, though, and you will always take my calls. And if someone in my organization needs medical help, especially for conditions like Marco's, then you treat them with no questions asked." Keisha thought about this carefully, because she would be binding herself to Vincent Caruso's world and becoming the personal doctor for criminals, and it was a deal that could destroy her or make her, and she was not sure which. But it was also a chance to do the work she had always dreamed of doing, and to help patients who desperately needed it. And after a long silence, she said, "I have conditions of my own." She said, "I will not treat injuries from criminal activities, and no gunshot wounds and nothing that would make me an accessory to crimes, and I will not be used to keep people alive so they can go back to hurting others." And Vincent listened without interrupting. Keisha continued and said, "Any discoveries I make and any treatments I develop, they get published in medical journals, and they become available to everyone, not just your people. And the research has to be legitimate and above board." Vincent extended his hand across the table and said, "Deal. And I am not asking you to become a criminal, Dr. Williams, and I am asking you to be exactly what you are, which is a doctor who saves lives that everyone else has written off." He said Marco was just another hopeless case to them, and another name on a death certificate waiting to be signed. And you proved them all wrong. And now I want you to keep proving them wrong for other patients who deserve a chance. Keisha shook his hand and felt the weight of what she was agreeing to. But she also felt excitement building in her chest because this was everything she had worked for, even if it came from the most unexpected source. That evening she sat with Marco for his regular checkup, and he was walking short distances now, and his speech was almost back to normal, and his mind was sharp again, and he said, "I hear you are setting up a research center because of me." Keisha said, "Because of you, yes, and you proved that my work could make a real difference, and that means I have a responsibility to keep pushing forward and to help other patients like you." Marco was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father's world is not what you think, and I mean it is what you think. But it is also more complicated than that, and he has done terrible things, and I know that. But he has also protected thousands of people and provided for families." He continued and said, "I am not trying to justify it, and I am just saying, nothing is simple." And Keisha nodded and said, "I know. And if the last few weeks have taught me anything, it is that the world is not divided neatly into good and evil." She said, "Sometimes you find hope in the darkest places, and sometimes you have to make impossible choices and live with the consequences. And that is just how life works." Marco asked, "Do you regret it and getting involved with us?" And Keisha thought about her mother working as a cleaning lady all these years, and she thought about the patients she had watched die because no one would fund her research, and she thought about Marco, who would be dead now if she had played it safe. She said, "No, I do not regret it, and ask me again in a year, and maybe my answer will be different, but right now I am exactly where I'm supposed to be." And Marco smiled and said, "Good, because you saved my life, Dr. Williams, and I owe you everything." Keisha said, "You do not owe me anything, and you just focus on getting completely better." And Marco nodded. But they both knew that bonds had been formed in this house that would last a lifetime. 6 months after Keisha first walked through the doors of the Caruso mansion, she stood in a brand new research facility, watching her team prepare for their first official clinical trial, and the Williams Center for Autoimmune Research had opened 3 weeks ago with a press conference that drew attention from major medical journals. The funding source was listed as the Caruso Family Foundation, which was a charitable organization that had suddenly become very generous in supporting medical research, and some journalists had raised eyebrows, and a few had asked pointed questions about Vincent Caruso and his business interests. But the science was solid, and Keisha's credentials were excellent, and Marco's recovery was undeniable, and the medical establishment, which was always hungry for success stories and new funding sources, had largely chosen to look the other way. Grace had quit her cleaning job and now worked as the facility's administrative coordinator, and it was a position she was overqualified for in terms of dedication and organizational skills, even if she lacked formal credentials, and Grace walked through the gleaming hallways with her head held high. She was no longer invisible and no longer overlooked, and she had an office with her name on the door, and people asked her opinion on things and treated her with respect. And sometimes she had to pinch herself to believe this was real. Marco had become Keisha's unofficial connection to the outside world, and he was still recovering and attending physical therapy and cognitive rehabilitation sessions, but he was also using his business degree to help manage the foundation's operations. He had meant what he said about going legitimate, and Keisha's research center had become his vehicle for that transition, and Vincent was proud of his son's choice, even if it meant Marco was leaving the family business behind. Vincent visited the center rarely because he preferred to keep his distance from the legitimate face of his charitable work. But when he did visit, Keisha saw the pride in his eyes, and it was pride in his son's recovery, but also in what she was building. On the day of their first clinical trial enrollment, Keisha stood in front of a room full of patients and their families, and these were people who had been turned away by every major hospital, and people whose conditions were considered too rare, or too experimental, or too hopeless to waste resources on. They were people just like Marco had been, and Keisha looked at their faces and saw fear and hope mixed together, and she took a deep breath before speaking. She said, "I cannot promise miracles because medical science does not work that way, but I can promise that we will try everything we know and we will keep trying when others would give up. And you are not just patients to us." She continued and said, "You are partners in research that could change medicine. And your courage in taking this chance does not just help you, and it helps everyone who will come after you. And every bit of data we gather, and every response we see brings us closer to better treatments." As she spoke, she caught her mother's eye across the room, and Grace was crying quietly with tears of joy running down her face. And everything they had risked, and everything they had sacrificed had led to this moment. After the patients had been seen and evaluated, and the staff had gone home for the day, Keisha stood alone in her office, and she looked at the framed newspaper article on her wall, and the headline read, "Breakthrough Treatment Saves Crime Boss's Son." The headline was dramatic, but the article itself was fair, and it acknowledged both the unusual circumstances and the legitimate science behind Marco's recovery. And Keisha's phone buzzed with a text from Marco. He wrote, "First trial patient just texted me and she is excited and scared, but mostly excited, and you are changing lives, Doc." And Keisha smiled and typed back, "We are changing lives, and none of this happens without all of us taking risks." She gathered her things to leave for the night and passed through the lobby where a bronze plaque had been installed, and it read, "The Williams Center for Autoimmune Research, founded in the year of our Lord and dedicated to treating the untreatable, because every patient deserves a chance." Keisha stood looking at that plaque for a long moment, and she thought about how far she had come from that struggling researcher in Philadelphia, and she had been given a platform by a criminal whose love for his son had overcome his mistrust of a system that had failed him. It was messy and complicated and morally ambiguous in ways that still made her uncomfortable sometimes, but it was also real, and the patients sleeping in the recovery wing upstairs were real, and the hope in their families' eyes was real. The treatments that would be developed here and that would eventually reach far beyond this facility to help people all over the world would be real, and that was what mattered most. Keisha walked out into the cool evening air where her mother waited by the car, and Grace asked, "Long day?" And Keisha replied, "The best kind of long day, and the kind where you know you are making a difference." As they drove away from the center past the security gates and into the regular world beyond, Keisha thought about the strange path that had brought her here, and she thought about the 100 doctors who could not save Marco because they were bound by convention and institutional caution. She thought about her mother, who had been invisible for so many years, finding the courage to speak up at exactly the right moment. And she thought about Vincent Caruso, who was a dangerous man capable of both violence and profound love. And she thought about herself and a young black woman with brilliant ideas who had finally been given the chance to prove what she could do, and who had seized that chance with both hands despite the risks. The world, she had learned, was full of impossible situations waiting for someone brave enough to find the solution, and sometimes that someone came from the most unexpected places. Sometimes genius arrived pushing a cleaning cart, and sometimes hope wore a white coat and carried student debt, and sometimes salvation required making a deal with the devil to do good work in the world, and sometimes, just sometimes, everything worked out exactly as it was meant to work out. And the Williams Center lights glowed in the rearview mirror as they drove into the night, and it was a beacon of hope built on the most unlikely foundation. It was proof that humanity, in all its flawed and complicated glory, could still find ways to save each other when it mattered most, and that second chances could come from anywhere, if you were brave enough to take them. 1 year after Grace Williams spoke up in that kitchen and changed everything, Keisha stood on a stage at a medical conference in Boston, presenting her research to hundreds of doctors and researchers from around the world, and she could hardly believe this was her life now. The presentation was titled, "Targeted Immunotherapy Approaches for Treatment-Resistant Autoimmune Encephalitis," and the room was packed with people who 6 months ago would not have given her the time of day, but now, They hung on her every word. She presented Marco's case along with data from the 15 other patients they had successfully treated at the Williams Center. And the results were remarkable. And 4 patients had made complete recoveries, and 9 showed significant improvement, and 2 were still in treatment but responding well. The questions came fast after her presentation, and some doctors were skeptical and some were curious and a few were openly hostile, because they did not like the idea that some young researcher had succeeded where they had failed. But Keisha answered every question with confidence and precision, and she had the data to back up everything she said, and by the end of the session, several major hospitals had approached her about collaboration, and 3 pharmaceutical companies wanted to discuss funding for larger trials. Grace sat in the back of the auditorium watching her daughter command that stage, and she thought about all the years of struggle and all the times people had told Keisha she was not good enough or smart enough or connected enough. She thought about that night in the Caruso kitchen, when she had taken the biggest risk of her life, and she knew without question that she had made the right choice, even though it had been terrifying at the time. After the presentation, Keisha found her mother in the hallway, and Grace pulled her into a hug and whispered, "I am so proud of you, baby." And Keisha said, "None of this happens without you, Mom, and you know that." They walked together through the conference center, and people kept stopping Keisha to introduce themselves and ask questions and congratulate her. And Grace watched her daughter handle it all with grace and intelligence. Marco met them for dinner that evening, and he looked completely healthy now. And you would never know he had been dying just a year ago. And he had enrolled in business school and was working on his MBA while still helping manage the foundation. He told Keisha that his father wanted to expand the Williams Center and open satellite clinics in 3 other cities. And Vincent was willing to fund the entire expansion. And Marco said, "My father does not show emotion easily. But what you did for me and what you are doing for other patients means everything to him." Keisha said, "I am grateful for the opportunity, but I also want to make sure we maintain our independence and our integrity." And Marco nodded and said, "That is why my father trusts you, because you are not afraid to push back when you need to." The next morning, Keisha returned to Connecticut and to the Williams Center, and she walked through the facility checking on patients and meeting with her research team and reviewing data from their latest trials. One of her patients was a young girl named Sophie, who had been sick for 2 years before coming to the center, and Sophie's parents had taken her to dozens of specialists and spent their life savings trying to find help, and everyone had told them there was nothing more that could be done. But Keisha had accepted Sophie into the program and started her on the targeted immunotherapy protocol, and 3 months later Sophie was back in school and playing with her friends, and her parents looked at Keisha like she was a miracle worker. Keisha sat with Sophie during her checkup, and the girl was chattering excitedly about her upcoming birthday party and how she was going to invite all her classmates, and Keisha smiled and thought about how this was why she became a doctor. Not for the recognition or the acclaim or even for the research, although those things mattered, but for moments like this when she could give a child back her childhood and give parents back their hope. That evening, Keisha sat in her office finishing paperwork when Vincent called, and he said, "I saw your presentation online and you did well, Dr. Williams." And she said, "Thank you, Mr. Caruso, and I hope we made you proud." Vincent was quiet for a moment and then said, "You gave me back my son and you built something important, and you are helping people who nobody else would help. So yes, you made me proud." And Keisha felt unexpected emotion rise in her throat. He continued and said, "I know our arrangement is complicated and I know you sometimes struggle with where the funding comes from. But I want you to know that what you are doing is good and it is pure and it matters more than anything I have ever built." Keisha said, "I appreciate that and I know this partnership is not traditional, but I also know we are saving lives, and that has to count for something." And Vincent said, "It counts for everything." And then he hung up. She sat there in the quiet office, thinking about the past year and all the ways her life had transformed, and she thought about the impossible choices and the moral gray areas and the fact that good things could come from complicated situations. Grace appeared in her doorway and said, "Ready to go home, baby?" And Keisha nodded and gathered her things, and they walked out together into the parking lot. As they drove away, Keisha looked back at the Williams Center all lit up against the evening sky, and she thought about all the patients inside getting treatment they could not get anywhere else and all the research being done that would help countless people in the future. She thought about Sophie and Marco and all the others who had been written off by conventional medicine and who now had second chances at life because someone had been willing to take a risk and try something different. Grace reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand and said, "You know what? The best part of all this is," and Keisha said, "What?" And Grace said, "Watching you become exactly who you were always meant to be." Keisha smiled and said, "I could not have done it without you," and Grace said, "We did it together, baby. And we took a leap of faith and it worked out, and that is all anyone can ask for." They drove home through the Connecticut evening, and Keisha thought about the future and all the possibilities stretching out before her, and she knew there would be more challenges and more difficult decisions and more moments when she questioned whether she had made the right choices. But she also knew that she was doing important work and helping people who desperately needed help, and using her gifts to make a real difference in the world. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Sometimes the path to doing good required walking through morally complicated territory, and sometimes the right thing came from the wrong place, and sometimes you had to make peace with imperfection in order to achieve something important. Grace had taught her that when she spoke up in Vincent Caruso's kitchen and risked everything for her daughter's future, and Keisha had learned it when she agreed to treat Marco, despite knowing what his family represented. And now, hundreds of patients would learn it as they received treatment at the Williams Center and got second chances they never thought possible, and all because a cleaning lady had the courage to speak, and a researcher had the courage to try. The Williams Center stood behind them in the darkness like a promise fulfilled, and ahead of them stretched roads not yet traveled, and lives not yet saved, and possibilities not yet imagined. And Keisha was ready for all of it.